Hello and welcome back to the channel. I want you all to take a listen to this in your face speech that this African woman gave to world leaders. It made them uncomfortable. But this was a powerful history that she taught about colonization and how it has affected people even to this day. This is definitely a speech that folk don't want to hear. The truth hurts the ears of the oppressor for sure. But anyway, take a listen at this speech.
11 generations affected by this massive, deep change called slavery. That would mean that if I was affected by slavery now, my son, my grandson, my great-grandson, my great-great-great-great, to the 11th generation would be a slave or would have been affected by slavery. That's how deep that societal change was. Some of the factors that led to the development of this huge change were because the Spanish had started to sail towards the Americas and colonized the Americas. That was between 1493 and 1898. And they found this massive land habited by Indians, and they began to colonize and get these huge tracts of land. Having acquired these big colonies, they did not have enough labor to manage these colonies. So there was a shortage. The Indians were hostile. You know what it's like when you have huge tracts of land and you can't use it? It becomes a liability on you. They could not find alternative source of labor. So this actually was the trigger for slave trade. So what happened was that the Europeans would take guns or gunpowder and other goods from Europe, go down to West Africa, pick this labor force or the slaves, put them on ships, take them to the Americas to work on the sugar plantation as the labor there. And this, as year after year for the 341 became a massive trade, and countries developed. Countries in Europe developed, countries in America developed as Africa underdeveloped. Another fact was that why this was possible was because the African was seen as somewhat of an inferior human being and could therefore, as a beast of burden, be used to do that work. Even worse was that the Church of England condoned it. Actually, clergymen owned slaves. Then there was also, of course, the military factors that the slaves that were captured here were captured because of military superiority and could be taken without much resistance because of that. How were these slaves treated? They were crammed into these huge ships and taken across the Atlantic. In the ships, because they needed big numbers and because the voyage took 80 days, they crammed them into decked, deckers, slats in the ship, and piled them one on top of the other on 6 foot by about, I think it was 1 foot or 1, 2 foot. They couldn't move, and they were chained. They wetted themselves there, they defecated there, they vomited there in those places, and the ground was so slippery that disease began to grow. It was very hot. They were beaten, they were killed for resistance, they were thrown overboard, they were starved. When they arrived in America, they were sold in slave markets like animals, totally humiliated. I watched a clip and I wanted to cry because women were stripped bare, men were stripped bare, and they were examining their teeth, their eyes, to see if they could fit the labor that was awaiting them. They were branded with hot irons, like how you brand your cows. You know, if you don't want your cows stolen, you put a chip in them. Then you branded them with a hot iron. The church, actually, the Church of England, branded slaves, and their brand was called society. My gosh. They were given new names. Their names in Africa would not do. They were given new names. They were raped. And they were also sexually abused for purposes of breeding more labor. This transatlantic slave trade, or the Middle Passage, was the largest oceanic forced migration in history. It is actually said that it changed the movement of sharks in the Atlantic, that sharks began to follow the ship because there was a ready meal. Somebody was going to be thrown overboard. And it is said that at the bottom of the sea, you will find, I don't know if this is true or not because this is many, many years ago, bones of those who either jumped to commit suicide or who were thrown over as punishment or who died. The Middle Passage, or the triangular trade, is actually not accurate because there was slave trade also in Asia. Slaves were taken from Mozambique. Slaves were taken from the coasts of East Africa. Many slave traders were women. We tend to think that slave traders were just men. No, some of them were actually women, and their names are recorded. They were even young, because if average lifespan around that time was between 30 and 40, you can imagine those who came to capture slaves here. The slave trades did not, the slaves were not docile. They didn't just chain them and drag them out. They fought. They resisted. They resisted on ships. They fought on ships. Some of their resistance was simply committing suicide. And they made it costly because traders had to increase the crews on ships. That was their form of resistance. Make it difficult for the traders. Traders not only fought the slave trade, slaves not only fought the slave trade, they also helped end it. Because, you know, when you're reading about abolition of slave trade, you only hear William Wilberforce and a few other men. But the slaves themselves actually fought. They had violent campaigns and uprisings. The slave trade continued to flourish long after it had been abolished. It was abolished in 1807, but you can see that up to 1867, 60 years later, it continued after abolition. Unfortunately, in more recent times, there is modern slavery, deep when we talk about something being deep, unless it's pulled by its very roots, it will come back, it will grow. The slave trade transformed the world. Colonies grew, became big, people became very rich. Some, like especially the west coast of Africa, was completely underdeveloped. There are stories on stories on stories about slave trade. Why am I concentrating on slave trade? It was a huge societal change. It was major, it impacted lives, continues to impact lives right now. But there was an uprising, there was a campaign against it, and there was major movements in the British Parliament and in the church and across Europe to end slave trade. It wasn't easy. I'm told that William Wilberforce presented the bill 9 times to abolish slavery. And he had to campaign, and he didn't have a lot of support. Why? Because those who owned slaves were there in Parliament. They were there in the church. It was entrenched. But he did not give up. One man, several men, it wasn't one man, there were many, did not give up the dream to change the world. It was not good enough for them to change it in one small area. It had to be abolished across. And in 1807, the law was passed. It began the collapse. Why am I talking about slave trade? Because it gives the lessons about some of the changes that we are currently living in that are so deep, that are so global, that are affecting generations. And it is incumbent upon each and every one of us, leaders across the world, leaders in Africa, leaders in the church, leaders in business, to begin to change. And nations across the world have begun to deal with the wicked societal change called corruption. Why should we pay attention to corruption? How bad is it? I am sure even as I spoke about slavery, the room went cold and quiet, because it's a very uncomfortable, horrible past. But so is corruption. Corruption undermines the Sustainable Development Goals. Nations fail to eradicate poverty, address hunger, secure good health care, and high-quality education for their citizens, guarantee gender equality and other human rights. It reduces and it increases inequality.
Okay, as I always say, the truth is a hard pill to swallow. The truth hurts the ears of the oppressor. They don't like to hear you talking about it. And this is why there's this deafening silence whenever we bring up African history and how the colonizers colonized the world and pretty much oppressed and terrified people all around the planet. But the truth is something that must be told, it must be heard, it must be taught. The truth is what it is, whether we like it or not. The truth will always be. I am done. Chop it up in the comment section. As always, keep it tight and keep it right. But until next time, I'm out. We hope you liked today's topic. Please leave your comments below. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, share it like this video, and with that, we're out. Be sure to ring the bell to be notified of new uploads on this channel, and also comment, share, like, and subscribe.